So why does Nietzsche present us with such a negative type as the last man? Why does he bang on about it? Well, the way Nietzsche thinks of philosophy, he doesn't think that he has some irresistible argument that can force us to agree with him about what we ought to do and how the world ought to be. So he's not like Kant, right? The Kantian style in philosophy is to go by what are called transcendental arguments. Transcendental argument says, we know from experience that the world is like this, and that's only possible if some other conditions obtain. Well, because experience tells us that the world is that way, those conditions must obtain, and therefore the intelligibility of our lives as we experience them requires that I'm right about whatever philosophical point I'm arguing. So this is the Kantian tradition of using reason as a kind of big stick. Nietzsche didn't think that any such stick is available. He didn't believe that there are these heavyweight philosophical arguments that can just force people to agree to see things his way. Rather, he thought that the best that philosophers can do is recommend courses of action or ideals that we should follow. So Nietzsche's noble ideal has two elements. One is what he calls amor fati, the love of fate. And the second, which is related to it, the second is a kind of way of dramatizing the idea of amor fati, is to affirm eternal recurrence. So I'll get to eternal recurrence in a minute. First of all, what is amor fati, the love of fate? Well, it's not fatalism. It's not the attitude of saying what will be, everything is in the lap of the gods. No. Love of fate is where you understand that everything that happened to you in your life is part of what made you who you are. So, in order to say yes to yourself, in order to affirm your life, to sort of shout an affirmative about who you are and the nature of your character and all the rest of it, you need to be able to say yes to all of the things that made you who you are. This is what Nietzsche tried to do in his autobiography, Ecce Homo. So if you remember, or rather, as you may discover if you read it, he has titles like Why I Am So Clever, Why I Am So Wise, Why I Write Such Good Books. And his answers to these questions, his explanations for his cleverness and his wisdom and the excellence of his books, is largely circumstance. So he says, I was ill. I was unable to continue my life as a philology professor. I was unable to write thick books of philosophy in the traditional encyclopedic German fashion. I had to do other things. I was forced to turn my attention elsewhere and find other ways of doing things and to experiment with, shorter form books and epigraphs and poetry and deranged prophetic writing of some sort. So if I'm quite pleased with my output, with my writing as the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, I have to say yes to my illness. I have to say yes to the headaches. And if I'm not willing to say yes to the headaches, then I can't say yes. I can't celebrate the books, the writing, my achievements, such as I take them to be. Now, there's a sort of less literary version of this. If you think about stories in which somebody has a bad accident and loses a leg, but they rebuild their life, and maybe through the rehabilitation process they meet somebody who then becomes their spouse or their best mate, or they get involved in some, the charity to support people with that kind of injury, or they design a thing, a new bit of technology that will help people in that position, or if they discover, if somebody lived a life of the body as a soldier or an athlete or something, and then loses a leg, so that they're forced to develop their minds, and then they find actually their minds are pretty good. If they didn't know it before, they realise they have capacities they didn't know. 10 years down the line, if you say to them, if you could unwish your accident, if you could have your leg back, would you? Sometimes they say, well, I wouldn't wish the same accident on anybody else, but if at this point, 10 years on, I were to say, I could somehow unwish or sort of undo the accident that robbed me of my leg, I'm not going to wish for it, because I would be wishing away the life that I now have, right? The friends that I've made, perhaps the spouse that I met, the skills I've developed, the capacities I've discovered in myself, all of that would go if I could somehow wish away the accident where I lost my leg. Now, if you can have that attitude, well, that's amor fati, right? So it's not it's not just kind of dull saying, well, what will be, we'll have to live with it. It's rather understanding that everything that happened to you, including accidents and illnesses and the like, that's part of what made you who you are. And in order to embrace who you are, you have to say yes to all of those things. And that's a personal version of the point that Nietzsche makes about civilizations and institutions, that if you go on interrailing around Europe, and you admire the fine buildings in Paris, and the Colosseum in Rome, and the Parthenon, and whatever else, all of those are built with imperial booty. All of those are the result of wealth accumulated through violence. So, as you stand there and admire the Parthenon and the Colosseum and the Eiffel Tower and whatever else, you can't have the one without the other. So, you can't have the great stuff without the ugliness. Now, when you make it at the societal level, it starts to sound like a kind of apologia for imperialism. And perhaps it is. Perhaps we would want to make a kind of society level version of Rorty's argument. So remember, Rorty says, look, the cost of freedom for everybody seems to be that the typical character types are petty, calculating, unheroic and bland. Well, if that's the price, then fine. And we might similarly say that if the price of not being imperialists, if the price of nobody being crushed under anybody else's heel is that you don't get the centres of imperial power where cultural greatness can flourish, well, too bad. Maybe that's a price worth paying. Anyway, the first part of Nietzsche's ideal type is amor fati, love of your fate, because it's your fate that made you who you are. So if you love yourself, you have to love all of the elements that made you who you are now.